Thea's name means simply divine. That is the whole of it. Not a name built from attributes, not a word borrowed from something older, but the bare fact of divinity itself, given as a name to a Titan woman who existed in the Greek imagination before the Olympians had assembled, before Zeus had taken his throne, before the world had settled into the arrangement that would hold for the classical age. She was the daughter of sky and earth, Eranos and Gaia, and she belonged to the generation of the Titans, those vast primary figures who stood at the beginning of the Greek theogony as the first children of the cosmos itself. Her name is simple. Her nature, as the ancient sources describe it, was not. Among all the domains that ancient tradition assigned to Thea, the one that appears most persistently in the oldest accounts is luminosity, not merely light in the physical sense, but the quality of radiance that manifests in things of lasting value. Gold and silver, in the ancient Greek understanding, did not simply reflect light. They concentrated it, held it, gave it back in a purer form than they received it. The gleam on the surface of gold in firelight, the cold brightness of silver in shade, these were understood in archaic Greek thought as belonging to a specific category of radiance that Thea embodied. She was the reason precious things shone. She was the source of the luminous quality in gemstones held up to catch the afternoon sun, the reason the first sight of the sea in morning could cause the eye to flinch. And from this Titan, whose name was a single word meaning divine, and who carried within herself the principle of luminosity itself, 3 children came into the world who would govern everything that light touched in the Greek cosmos. That is where Selene begins, not in a myth, not in a story of something that happened, but in a genealogy, in the placement of a daughter within a family whose business was the illumination of the sky. Hesiod tells us this. In the Theogony, composed in the late 8th or early 7th century BCE, Hesiod sets down the lineage of Selene with the precision of someone who understands that origin is everything, that a god's parentage determines the domain they inherit, the quality of power they carry, the position they hold in the great arrangement of the cosmos. At lines 371 through 374, in dactylic hexameter, Hesiod names the children of Hyperion and Thea, Helios, Selene, and Eos, the sun, the moon, the dawn, 3 children from 2 Titans, and the 3 of them between them, governing every transition that light made across the ancient Greek sky, from the beginning of morning to the end of night. Hyperion, the father, carries a name that the ancient sources interpreted to mean he who goes above, or the one above. He was the Titan of heavenly light and celestial motion, not the sun itself, which belonged to his son Helios, but the principle underlying the movement of luminous bodies through the sky, the governing intelligence behind the fact that the great lights of the cosmos followed their paths without deviation, without error, without rest. He appears in Hesiod's Theogony as one of the 12 Titans, the first generation of divine children born from Eranos and Gaia, and his name carries within it the vertical dimension that defines celestial existence, to go above, to exist at the level where the sky begins, where the atmosphere thins into something purer. In the earliest stratum of Greek theological imagination, Hyperion occupied that height, not as a narrative figure with adventures and conflicts, but as a presence, an original lord of the luminous upper world, whose business was motion across a sky where no Olympian yet existed, to look upward from below. The world that Hyperion inhabited was older than the world most familiar to classical Greek religion. It was a world without Zeus's authority, without the structures of Olympian governance, without the particular relationships and hierarchies that the great classical myths assume as their background. It was a world in which the most important facts were primary ones: sky, earth, light, the movement of great celestial bodies through the air, and the titans who embodied and governed those primal conditions. From Hyperion, who goes above, and from Thea, whose name is simply the word for goddess, there came Selene, her name carrying within it the silver light that would be her domain, her inheritance drawn from both sides of her parentage. From her father she inherited the principle of celestial motion, the occupation of the upper sky, the nightly progression across the dome of heaven. From her mother she inherited luminosity in its reflective, quiet, precious form, not the blazing fire of her brother Helios, not the hot gold of the sun, but something cooler and more patient, the light that falls on sleeping things, the light that makes a still pond visible in the middle of the night, the light that does not demand attention the way the sun does, but accumulates quietly across the dark hours until the whole landscape has been gently rearranged by silver. In Hesiod's account, her birth follows from her parentage with the inevitability of something that could not have been otherwise. Given these two titans, given the pairing of height with luminosity, the child who governs the moon is the natural outcome. The three siblings, Helios, Selene, and Eos, occupied in the ancient Greek imagination a position of particular beauty. They were not the most powerful gods, they were not the most celebrated. In the great hierarchies of Olympian religion, in the festivals and temples and civic cults that defined Greek religious life in the classical period, they were not figures of the first importance. But in the oldest structure of the Greek cosmos, in the original arrangement of the divine world as the archaic poets understood it, they constituted something necessary and complete, a relay of light across all the hours. Ios, the dawn, whose rose-colored fingers opened the eastern sky and whose chariot preceded her brothers, broke the dark at the beginning of each day. Helios blazed through the hours from morning to evening, his four-horse chariot arcing from east to west across the visible sky, his light the organizing fact of every waking hour. And then, after the last gold had faded from the western edge of the sky and the dark had gathered itself back over the world, Selene took up the relay, her silver vehicle rising in the east, her cooler light spreading across the landscape, while the world below turned toward rest. The three of them together covered the full span of a day and a night. Together they accounted for every quality of light the Greek world knew: the warming gold of morning, the high white blaze of noon, the long amber of afternoon, the vanishing pink of dusk, and then the silver that followed when all of that was gone. Nothing was uncovered. Every hour had its luminous governance. The Taya, sitting in that pre-Olympian light, had made something whole. Three children, from whom no hour escaped, no transition went ungoverned, no quality of light was left without its divine source. The Greek theogony, at the level of its deepest structure, is a narrative about how the cosmos came to be organized, how the original chaos of Hesiod's cosmogony, that first yawning void, gradually acquired structure, governance, form, the arrangement of things into domains held by beings capable of maintaining them. The Titans are the first layer of that organization, the original children of sky and earth, who took up the primary functions of the cosmos and held them before the Olympians arrived to displace them. Hyperion held the principle of celestial luminous motion. Thea held the principle of radiance, of the gleam in precious things. And their three children, between them, held every transition of light that the sky could offer. There is a completeness to this that the later Olympian pantheon, with its more complex political arrangements and its more particular mythological stories, does not quite replicate in the same clean way. Selene's mother Thea appears relatively rarely in the surviving ancient sources, which is itself a function of her antiquity. The Titans, as a generation, recede from the foreground as the Olympian myths accumulate weight and cultural priority, and Thea, in particular, having no great mythological narrative attached to her name, becomes almost purely genealogical. But the domain the ancient sources assign to her is worth holding. Pindar, writing in the 5th century BCE, addresses Thea in one of his odes and connects her explicitly to the value of gold, specifically to the way gold outshines everything else in luminosity, the way it catches the eye before any other substance, the way its brightness seems to come from within. This is Thea's inheritance made manifest in her grandchildren's achievements, Pindar suggests. Wherever luminosity gathers, wherever light concentrates and intensifies in the material world, there is Thea's influence, the gem that catches the sun, the surface of the sea in full morning, the disk of the full moon against a clear dark sky. All of these were understood in this tradition as expressions of the same luminous quality that Thea embodied, the divine capacity to hold and return light, to be the vessel through which radiance reached the world. What it means for light itself to have a mother is not a question the ancient sources pause to ask. They simply record the genealogy and move on, because in the Greek theological imagination, of course light has a mother. Of course the radiance that moves across the sky each night belongs to a lineage. Of course the qualities of the cosmos, its heat, its light, its motion, its darkness, its tides, its seasons, are not impersonal forces, but expressions of beings who hold those qualities as their nature, who were born into them, who inherited them from parents who held earlier, more primary versions of the same capacities. The ancient Greek cosmos was not a physical system that operated according to laws. It was a family. It was an arrangement of beings in relationship, each one holding a piece of the whole, each one occupying a position within a genealogy that traced back far enough, reached Eranos and Gaia, sky and earth, and before them, chaos itself, the original condition before even the sky existed. Within that framework, light having a mother is not a metaphor, it is the literal structure of the world. Selene, then, enters the ancient Greek theological record not as a later addition, not as a borrowed or syncretic figure, but as one of the oldest divine personages in the Greek cosmological tradition, a Titan's daughter, present in the original arrangement of the divine world, before the Olympians had assembled. Her place in the cosmos established not by narrative, but by genealogy, by the logic of inheritance, by the fact that her father went above, and her mother held the principle of luminosity, and from those two sources there was no other child that could emerge but the one who carries silver light across the night sky. This is where her story begins, not with a chariot, not with a descent toward a sleeping figure on a mountainside, not with any event at all, but with a name and a genealogy that is itself so old it feels less like a beginning than like something that was always already true. The distinction between Selene and the other divine figures associated with the moon in Greek tradition is one that the ancient sources are, in their better moments, careful to maintain. By the time of Hesiod's writing, the Greek pantheon already contained Artemis, the Olympian goddess associated with the hunt and with wild places, a daughter of Zeus and Leto, twin sister to Apollo. It contained Hecate, a figure of considerable antiquity and complex associations, thresholds, crossroads, the liminal spaces between states, and in some traditions, the night sky and the dark of the moon. All three, Selene, Artemis, and Hecate, were associated in various ways with the moon in ancient Greek tradition, but they were not the same figure. The scholar Walter Burkert, in his work on Greek religion, has emphasized this distinction against the later tendency toward syncretic conflation, the tendency, strongest in the Hellenistic and Roman periods, to layer these three goddesses into a single triple figure, a lunar goddess who was one thing by day, another by night, and another in the underworld. This conflation has its own history and its own interest, but it is a later development, and the classical era sources generally resist it. In the 5th century BCE tragedy, in the earlier Hesiodic material, in the vase painting of the archaic and classical periods, Selene, Artemis, and Hecate occupy their separate positions. Artemis is an Olympian, a daughter of Zeus, born on Delos, present at the great civic festivals, celebrated in the temples at Ephesus and Brauron, and across the Greek world. Selene is a Titan's daughter, not Olympian in the civic sense, not housed in the same network of great temples and festivals, not a figure of the same public, political, religious life. Hecate exists in her own register, archaic, boundary-dwelling, associated with the dark of the moon, rather than its visible face, with the power of magic and of things that stand at thresholds. Three figures, three distinct positions in the divine world, three different relationships to the moon's light and the lunar cycle. The later conflation is understandable once Hellenistic religious thought began identifying divine functions across traditions, looking for correspondences and unifications. The three figures' shared association with the moon made them natural candidates for theological merging. But that merging is something that happened over time through a process of gradual identification, and it is not where these figures begin. Selene's position in the divine hierarchy of classical Greek religion is one that repays attention precisely because it does not fit the familiar Olympian template. She is not a minor goddess. She is not an obscure figure. She is a Titan's daughter, holding one of the most fundamental cosmic domains, the governance of the night sky, the light that the world sees when the sun is gone, and she holds it with the quiet authority of something that existed before the great political reorganization of the divine world that the Olympians represent. The Titans were displaced by the Olympians in the mythological narrative of the Theogony, the Great War, the Titanomachy, in which Zeus and his siblings overthrew Kronos and his generation and established the current order of the cosmos. But Selene, like her brother Helios and her sister Eos, continued without displacement. The nightly rise of the moon is not something that changes when political authority in the divine world changes hands. The celestial machinery continues. Vermillion continues her arc, regardless of who holds the throne of Olympus. Her position in the Greek theological world is neither Olympian nor displaced Titan. It is something different from both, something older and more elemental in its function, holding a domain so necessary and so fundamental that no political reorganization of the divine world can reassign it. The ancient sources treat this without drama. Hesiod does not explain why the celestial Titan children continue their functions after the Titanomachy. The arrangement is simply what it is. The sun rises, the moon travels, the dawn opens the eastern sky, and the beings who govern these things continue doing so, generation after generation of divine narrative notwithstanding. There is in this a certain quality of the elemental and the unarguable. Some things in the cosmos simply continue because they are the kind of things that continue. Selene's nightly passage across the sky is that kind of thing. It is also worth holding the particular quality of what Thea gave to Selene in terms of the ancient sources' understanding of her luminosity. The moon, in the archaic and classical Greek understanding, was a luminous body. That is, it gave light, it made the night visible, it silvered the landscape with something that was not quite daylight, but was a version of light recognizable as such. The Greek theological tradition did not, in its religious and mythological dimension, concern itself with the question of whether the moon produced its own light or reflected the sun's. That was a question for natural philosophy, for the physical speculation of the pre-Socratics, and it existed in an entirely separate register from the religious and mythological tradition. Within that mythological tradition, Selene was luminous because she was luminous, because her mother's nature had given her the capacity to hold and project radiance, because her domain was precisely the night sky and the light that distinguished it from pure darkness. The silver quality of that light, cool, reflective, not the fire of Helios, but something more patient and more still, can be understood as an expression of Thea's particular inheritance, the luminosity of precious metal, which holds light without generating it, which gives back what it receives in a form that feels different from the original. Golden firelight is warm, active, almost aggressive in its brightness. Silver in moonlight is different. It holds the light without consuming it, gives it back without heat, makes things visible without making them seem lit from within. That is Selene's light. That is what Thea passed to her. The archaic period of Greek poetry in which Hesiod was working was a moment of theological systematization. The great cosmological and genealogical poems, the Theogony foremost among them, were attempts to set down in ordered form what had previously existed in a more dispersed oral tradition, a tradition of stories and genealogies that different communities and different singers held in different versions, without a single authoritative text to refer to. Hesiod's project in the Theogony was to organize this material, to establish canonical lineages, to settle the parentages of the major divine figures, to arrange the whole divine world into a genealogical structure that could account for the current state of the cosmos. His poem became, over the subsequent centuries, something close to a theological baseline. Later authors, tragedians, lyric poets, mythographers, scholars could depart from Hesiod's account, add detail, offer alternatives, but they always departed from him, which means they always had to acknowledge him first. He was the starting point. Lines 371 through 374 of the Theogony are the starting point for Selene. Those few lines, set down in dactylic hexameter in the late 8th or early 7th century BCE, gave her canonical parentage, named her siblings, placed her in the oldest and most fundamental layer of the Greek divine genealogy. Everything that came after, every myth, every hymn, every vase painting, every scholiast's note, every Roman poet who reached for the image of the silver chariot and the moon, rested on that foundation. The three names, Helios, Selene, Eos, set down in the Theogony's careful hexameter, as though they had always been there waiting to be written, as though the act of setting them down was not creation, but recognition, not invention, but the formal acknowledgement of an arrangement that had existed before the poem and would exist after it. Dactylic hexameter, the meter of epic, the meter of the Iliad and the Odyssey, the meter of the Theogony itself, is a long line, 6 feet of alternating long and short syllables, arranged in the particular pattern that gives the verse its characteristic forward movement, its rolling accumulation of syllables that carries the listener through the line toward its conclusion. It is a meter suited to large subjects, the rage of Achilles, the wanderings of Odysseus, the birth of the gods. In that meter, in a poem that was setting down the origins of everything, Hesiod wrote the names of 3 luminous Titan children, not as heroes, not as subjects of stories. as a genealogical fact, embedded in the larger genealogical architecture of the theogony, placed in their position in the family of the cosmos with the quiet authority of something that everyone already knew and that was now, for the first time, being written down. What Hesiod was doing in those lines, and in the theogony as a whole, was an act of preservation as much as composition. The oral tradition from which he drew his material had been holding these genealogies for generations, passing them from singer to singer, from community to community, in the flexible, variable form that oral tradition takes, where the essential facts survive, but the details can shift between one telling and the next. To set them down in writing, in the formal permanence of a composed hexameter poem, was to give them a kind of stability that oral transmission could not quite provide. Selene's parentage, her position in the luminous triad of Titan children, her name in those lines of the theogony, these things received the permanence of text. Every subsequent Greek and Roman author who mentioned Selene and her parentage was, in some sense, working within the authority of those lines, even when they did not explicitly cite Hesiod, even when they did not consciously know they were doing so. The theogony became the background assumption of the tradition, the theological air that later authors breathed without necessarily thinking about it. There is something quietly remarkable about that. A poem composed in the late 8th century BCE in a village in Boeotia, possibly around the time that Greek writing was still a relatively new and limited technology, set down the canonical genealogy of the moon goddess in a way that would structure how she was understood for centuries to come, through the classical period, through the Hellenistic period, through the Roman Empire's assimilation of Greek mythology into its own religious and literary culture. The three names in dactylic hexameter, Helios, Selene, Eos, the family arrangement that accounted for the full relay of light across the sky, the parentage that connected them to Hyperion, who goes above, and Thea, who holds the principle of radiance. All of it set down in those few lines, with the compression and authority of someone who knew that the genealogy was not his to invent, but his to record, to lift from the flowing, variable stream of oral tradition and hold in the fixed form of a written text. In that act of writing, something very old was given the shape it needed to travel across time. The three children of Hyperion and Thea, who had existed in the Greek theological imagination long before Hesiod composed his lines about them, were given their permanent arrangement, their positions confirmed, their parentage established, their domains implied by the names themselves: Helios, the sun; Selene, the moon; Eos, the dawn; and Thea, their mother, sitting somewhere in that pre-Olympian light, with her name meaning simply divine, and her nature associated with the gleam on the surface of precious things, had produced from herself and from Hyperion, who goes above a triad, that would govern the sky's light for as long as the Greek theological tradition continued, and as it turned out, considerably longer than that.
The three names waited in the theogony the way old things wait in written texts, without urgency, without any awareness of the passage of time between their setting down and any given reader's encounter with them. A reader in the 5th century BCE encountered them,
and a reader in the Hellenistic period encountered them, and a reader in the Roman Empire encountered them, and someone reading Hesiod now will encounter them in the same form, the same dactylic hexameter, the same three luminous Titan children, set down in the same order, as though the family had always been there, exactly as the poem described them, waiting quietly to be named. On the east pediment of the Parthenon, at the far right corner where the composition ends, there is a horse's head carved in marble. The neck is bent. The stone animal's face tilts downward, and slightly to the side, as though the weight of the night's labor has finally become too much to hold against. The eyes are heavy, not closed, but carrying a particular quality of weariness that the sculptor understood well enough to render in Pentelic marble, 2,500 years before anyone would stand in the British Museum and look at it under electric light. It is Selene's horse. The night's great arc has been completed. The chariot has done what it was built to do, and this animal, one of the two white horses that drew it across the full dome of the dark sky, has arrived at the edge of the day with the journey finished and is sinking, spent and still beautiful, into the margin of the pediment where the stone was simply allowed to end. The Parthenon was completed in 432 BCE, its sculpted pediments installed during the Great Civic Building Program under Pericles that remade the Acropolis following the Persian destruction of the earlier temple. What the sculptors chose to put at the corners of that pediment was not decoration in the incidental sense. It was time itself, made visible in the bodies of horses. At the left corner, Helios's horses rise, 4 of them in the earlier tradition, their necks arched with energy, their stone mouths open, the morning coming up around them. At the right corner, Selene's horse descends. The two moments together frame everything else that happens in between: Athena's birth, the gathering of gods, within a single passage of hours from dawn to dark. The chariot of the moon, in this composition, is not merely a mythological vehicle. It is the outer edge of time within which all divine events occur. That sinking head has not always been in London. For most of its existence, it remained on the Acropolis, high above the city, visible from the plain below, and from the sea, the horse's exhausted face looking out over whatever weather the Aegean sent, across the Attic hills. In the years when the pediment was intact and painted, the marble tinted in the colors that classical sculpture carried before the paint was lost and the stone reverted to its own white. The horse would have been a different thing entirely. The wariness would have been colored. The stone eyes would have held pigment. What is now a meditation on form would have been, in its original context, a creature finishing its night, rendered in full presence at the edge of a building that housed the city's most important deity. Whatever the painter chose for the color of those eyes, the next position told everything. The night was done. The Homeric hymn to Selene, the 32nd hymn in the collection, sets out the arc of that night's journey, with the kind of careful attention the hymns typically reserve for the moments that matter most. According to the hymn, Selene rises from the waters of the ocean stream, Okeanos, the great river that ancient Greek geography placed at the outer boundary of the known world, encircling the earth like a frame around a painting. She rises from those waters, and as she rises, her silver light begins to reach across the dark air, touching the earth below, illuminating the landscape that had been in full darkness since her brother Helios last crossed the sky and descended into the west. The mortals on the earth look upward. The hymn does not make a great dramatic event of this. It describes it as something that simply happens, night after night, the ascending chariot, and the light it spreads, and the faces of ordinary people turning upward in the dark. It is regular, it is enormous, it is quiet. The ocean stream from which she rises was, in ancient Greek cosmological geography, not quite a body of water in the way that any familiar sea was a body of water. Okeanos was a boundary condition. It was where the organized world ended, and something older and less defined began. To rise from it was to emerge from the outermost margin of everything knowable into the dome of the sky, where the chariot's path was already waiting, the same arc it had traced the night before, and the night before that, worn into the air by the regular passage of wheels that left no visible track but were never lost. Selene rises from that margin and begins the ascent. The horses find the upward path. The chariot moves. In the most widely attested version of the ancient tradition, those horses are white. Two of them, white, their traces connected to a silver vehicle, whose identifying color appears consistently across the different media in which ancient artists rendered this subject. Vast painters working in Attica from roughly the 5th century BCE onward depicted the chariot and its horses in the visual shorthand that red figure technique made available. Dark background, pale forms. The crescent above Selene's head, rendered as a thin curved line that announced her identity to any viewer who knew the convention, which was any viewer in classical Athens. The horses themselves, on a vase, are necessarily small. The artist works within the constraints of the vessel's surface, the curve of the clay, the available space between the chariot's wheels, and the edge of the composition. But the whiteness of the horses is there in the convention, in the way they are rendered against the dark ground, in the deliberate choice to make them the brightest presence in the image. The alternative tradition is worth holding alongside the better-known one. Ancient scholiasts, the commentators who preserve their annotations in the margins of manuscripts, sometimes noting variant versions of myths that the main text did not bother to record because they were already familiar, cite references in the lost works of Aeschylus to a version of Selene's chariot in which the animals are not horses at all, but bulls or possibly oxen. This detail has attracted scholarly interest for an obvious reason. The crescent moon and the arc of horns share a curve. The connection between the moon's shape in its crescent phase and the profile of a bull's horns would have been available to anyone in the ancient Mediterranean world who looked at both things and noticed what they had in common. Whether the tradition of the bull-drawn chariot is older than the tradition of the white horses, or whether the two simply coexisted as regional or authorial variants, is a question the surviving evidence cannot fully answer. What the scholiasts preserve is the possibility that the chariot was once imagined differently, that the animal at its traces was chosen for its shape rather than its color, for the curve of horn rather than the gleam of coat. The crescent, in whatever form it appears in the tradition, on the heads of oxen, above Selene's own head as a diadem, is her most consistent identifying mark. In Attic red figure vase painting from the 5th century BCE onward, the crescent diadem becomes increasingly standardized as the attribute that distinguishes Selene from any other figure who might be depicted in a chariot at night. An ancient painter adding that thin curved line above a figure's head was doing what iconographic convention exists to do, making identification certain without needing to write a name beside the image. The crescent alone was enough. By the Hellenistic period, Cretan representations of Selene refined this convention further, often adding a torch held in one hand, the crescent and the torch together, forming a vocabulary of identification precise enough to survive the long distance between a sculptor's workshop and a modern viewer's encounter with the finished object in a museum case. On Roman sarcophagi, Selene descends. This is the particular moment that funerary sculpture returned to repeatedly in the Roman imperial period, because the story of Selene's descent served the purposes of those who commissioned sarcophagi better than any other episode in her mythology. Sarcophagi were made for the grieving. They were carved with scenes intended to offer the living something to look at in the years after the burial, scenes that connected the fact of the death with frameworks of meaning large enough to hold it. Selene descending from her chariot, moving toward the sleeping figure she has come to visit on her nightly circuit, is a scene that concerns itself with the connection between a living presence and an unconscious one, between a wakefulness that keeps returning and a sleep that does not end. The Capitoline museums in Rome hold examples of this composition. The Palazzo al Temps holds others. The robes billow in the marble as though a wind has caught them in the moment of descent. The crescent is above her head. The face, where the carving is well preserved, carries whatever the sculptor understood a goddess to carry when she has left her chariot and is moving towards something still and sleeping far below her natural height. The carving of Selene on marble was an act with a specific audience, the people who came to look at the sarcophagus in the years following a burial. Those viewers were not theologians working through doctrinal questions about the nature of the soul. They were people with a grief of their own, looking at stone, finding in the familiar image of the goddess descending from her silver vehicle a framework they already knew. The scene was not obscure to them. It was a known story, made permanent in a form that would outlast the grief that commissioned it, outlast the people who had sat with it, outlast the memory of exactly who lay inside. What remains is the marble, and Selene still descending, robes still caught in a wind that has been frozen in stone for 17 or 18 centuries. The white horses that drew her chariot had, in the parallel tradition, a counterpart team pulling a different vehicle across the daytime sky. Helios's chariot was drawn by 4 horses, fiery, energetic, associated in the tradition with enormous difficulty of management, the heat and urgency of a solar crossing given physical form in the animals at the traces. When Phaethon, in the Ovidian telling and its Greek precursors, took his father's reins and could not control the horses, the disaster followed directly from the horses' nature. They were not manageable by someone without the skill and authority that Helios carried. Selene's horses, in the tradition, carry a different quality. 2 rather than 4. White rather than fire-colored. The night crossing does not carry the same register of urgency. The chariot of the moon is not a vehicle that threatens to go wrong. Its pace is what it has always been, its path the same arc, its horses moving with the particular unhurried certainty of animals who have made this crossing more times than any individual memory could contain. The parallel between the 2 chariots, sun and moon, Helios and Selene, the day's blaze and the night's silver, was a structural feature of how the ancient tradition organized its cosmos. The family relationship between the 2 divinities gave the parallel a genealogical basis, the same parents, the same essential nature of luminous celestial motion, the same mode of crossing a sky that was understood as the kind of space a chariot could cross. But the 2 vehicles were not identical, and the tradition was careful to preserve their differences. Different colors, different numbers of animals, different qualities of light produced, different relationships to the mortals below who looked upward. Helios at noon was too bright to look at directly. Selene at the full moon was something a person could look at for as long as they wished, watching the light move across water or open ground, following the shadows that the chariot's passage produced in the landscape below. The Homeric hymn to Selene describes those shadows in its way. The earth is illuminated. What had been dark becomes visible, and what becomes visible includes the shadows that the light creates, the edges of things, the shapes of hills against the night sky, the shimmering surface of water catching the reflected light of a chariot that is nowhere near the water but is high above it, its influence reaching down. The hymn is brief, 32 hymns in the collection, and this one is not the longest. But what it preserves is the basic shape of the ancient experience of moonlight, the specific quality of silver illumination that is not daylight, that does not expose everything the way noon does, that instead gives each visible thing a version of itself made from shadow and light in equal and unfamiliar proportions. Moonlight was, in ancient practice, useful. It was what allowed travel at night, what allowed fishermen to work, what allowed certain agricultural activities to take place after the day's heat had subsided. The practical relationship between the Greek world and the actual light of the moon was direct and ongoing. This is worth holding alongside the mythological imagery, not as a corrective to it, but as its ground. The chariot crossing the sky and the light useful to the fishermen working in the dark are two descriptions of the same thing, neither one invalidating the other. The tradition that placed a goddess at the reins of a silver vehicle and the person on the ground who was glad of the light to see by were not in contradiction. The light was both things at once, a divine presence crossing overhead and a practical resource available to anyone who needed to move or work after dark. The Argonautica of Apollonius of Rhodes, composed in the 3rd century BCE, contains a passage in Book 4 that describes the moon's light with a quality of attention that goes slightly beyond the incidental. Apollonius is telling the story of the Argonauts' return journey, and the moon appears in a context that is not primarily about the moon, but the image Apollonius reaches for, the great arc of the nocturnal crossing, carries in it something of what any careful observer of the Greek night would have known. The moon rising from the ocean stream, moving through the great overhead passage, illuminating the sleeping earth below, is a pattern so regular and so established in the imaginations of people who lived without artificial light that it required almost no elaboration. The moon crossing overhead was simply what happened when the day was over. The chariot was simply the myth that the Greeks gave to the experience of watching that crossing happen night after night in a world where no other light competed with it. To say it was regular is not to say it was unnoticed. The Greeks noticed the moon with the kind of attention that comes from living in its light. They noticed which phase it was in, because the phase determined the date, and the date determined which festivals were due, which offerings were appropriate, which things were permitted, and which were not. They noticed when it rose and when it set, because those facts mattered to how a night was organized. They noticed when it was full, because a full moon was a particular kind of night, bright enough to see by clearly, bright enough to make travel safer, bright enough that the chariot at its zenith seemed to fill the sky with a presence that the crescent or the dark moon simply did not produce. All of this noticing was practical, and all of it was also in a world that had not separated the practical from the religious in the way that later thinking would, a form of relationship with the goddess who drove the chariot. The chariot itself, the specific vehicle, the silver vessel with its traces and its wheels, the seat where Selene stood or sat as she guided the white horses across the arc, is described more in its iconographic form than in any extended literary account that has fully survived. What the vase painters gave it is what has come down most clearly, a vehicle consistent with the type of chariot that would have been recognizable in Greece. 2 wheels, a body large enough to carry a standing figure, drawn by animals whose power was proportional to the distance they were expected to cover. In the actual sky, above the actual earth, the chariot was implied by the moon's motion. The arc of its passage from horizon to horizon was the evidence that something was carrying it, and the tradition supplied the specific form of the carrier, a chariot, because chariots were the vehicle of the noble and the divine. White horses, because the chariot's driver was the moon, and the moon's color was not fire. In Hellenistic sculpture, Selene acquires a fuller iconographic vocabulary than she carries in classical-era vase painting. The crescent is still there, above the head, but the figure is now rendered in 3 dimensions with the additional detail that sculptural tradition both required and permitted. The torch appears, held in one hand, its flame consistent with the role of a nocturnal luminary who carries her own light rather than waiting for it to be reflected. The robes are carved with the billowing quality that Hellenistic sculptors used to suggest motion, the fabric caught in an implied wind that does not appear in the composition but is made visible by its effect on the cloth. The figure is in motion. The chariot has deposited her somewhere, or she is about to return to it, and the moment the sculptor has chosen is the moment between the vehicle and wherever she is going. The crescent marks her. The torch illuminates. The robes carry the speed of something that has been crossing the sky. On the vases, the crescent above her head was made with a single curved line of the painter's brush, applied after the figure was already laid out against the dark ground, a thin curve of fired clay, ochre on black. The painter added it to make identification certain, to ensure that any viewer who looked at the image and needed to know which of the goddesses was depicted would have the answer in that one small mark. It is the most economical piece of iconographic information in the entire tradition of Selene's representation. One curved line, and the figure is no longer ambiguous. The chariot might be any chariot. The robes might be any divine robe. The horses might be any divine horses. But the crescent above the head is specific. It belongs to one figure in the entire pantheon, and once it was there, the painter's work of identification was done. The arc that the Homeric hymn describes, rising from the ocean stream, curving across the sleeping earth, illuminating the landscape below, and the faces of the mortals who looked upward, was not a small thing in the ancient imagining. The earth, in Greek cosmological geography, was a disk or a slightly curved surface surrounded by the ocean stream and covered above by the dome of the sky. The chariot's path went from one edge of that disk to the other, or from the ocean's rim to the ocean's opposite rim, passing through the highest point of the sky at the zenith of the arc. The scale of the journey was the scale of everything. There was no part of the earth that the chariot's light did not touch, no horizon it did not eventually clear, no landscape so remote that the silver light failed to reach it. The arc was total. The journey covered everything there was. This quality of totality is part of what the sculptors at the Parthenon were reaching for when they chose to put the chariot teams at the corners of the pediment. The horses of Helios rising at the left, the horse of Selene sinking at the right. The entire divine drama in the center of the composition, Athena's birth and the assembled Olympians, is framed by a cycle that is larger than any of the events within it. Whatever the gods do, whatever the stories contain, the chariots keep moving. The sun still rises, and the moon still sets. The arc is not interrupted by divine drama. It continues regardless. In placing the chariot teams at the corners, the sculptors acknowledged something that the tradition held consistently. The celestial motions were not subordinate to the events of myth. They were the framework within which all mythological events occurred. Selene's horse sinking at the right corner of the Parthenon pediment is not a detail at the edge of the composition. It is the edge of time itself, and everything that happened between those two horse heads was bounded by it. The exhaustion in that stone face is real, or as real as the sculptor could make it. The neck bent with genuine weariness, the head tilted at the angle of a creature that has arrived at the end of something long and is allowing the weight of it to show, not because the weight was too much, but because the journey is finished and there is no reason left to hold it back. It is not distress, it is completion. The horse's face at the right corner of the pediment carries the quality of something that has done exactly what it was built to do across the full extent of the sky and has arrived at the margin where the stone ends and the daylight begins. The path from the ocean stream to that margin, the great nocturnal arc that Apollonius of Rhodes described in the Argonautica, that the Homeric hymn traced from its beginning in the waters of Okeanos, was the same path every night, rising, curving, reaching the zenith where the full moon hung directly overhead and the light was at its strongest, the shadows at their shortest, the landscape below at its most clearly resolved into silver and shadow. Then descending, the arc beginning its downward slope toward the western horizon, the horses still moving at the same unhurried pace they had carried since the beginning of the night, the chariot still running smooth on a path so thoroughly practiced that nothing about it required more than the continuation of what had always been done. The ocean stream was waiting at the end of the descent, as it had been waiting at the beginning of the ascent the night before. Selene would emerge from it again the following night. The white horses would find the upward path again. The crescent above her head would catch whatever ancient eyes were still open, late enough to watch the moon clear the eastern horizon and begin the ascent once more. The arc would repeat. It had been repeating since before the tradition had words precise enough to describe it, and it would go on repeating after every version of every description had aged past the point of being read. What Apollonius of Rhodes described in Book 4 of the Argonautica was not a particular night in a mythological sequence. He was reaching for the pattern, the great arc of the nocturnal crossing, rising from the ocean stream, curving across the sleeping earth, the world below dark, and still, except for whatever the chariot's silver light touched as it moved overhead. The Argonauts are sailing. The night is happening around them, and the moon is doing what the moon always does. The chariot is completing what the chariot always completes, and the earth below is receiving the light with the same patience it has always shown, not asking for it, not refusing it, simply lying open under the arc of a crossing so old and so regular that it has long since ceased to require any particular attention from the things it illuminates. The passing of that light across a sleeping landscape has a quality that the ancient tradition found worth preserving in multiple forms. The hymn, the vase painting, the relief sculpture, the sarcophagus. Not because the ark was dramatic, but precisely because it was not. It was the nightly fact of the world, immense and calm and repeating, the silver vehicle and its white horses, and the goddess at the reins crossing the full extent of the sky, above an earth that continued on below without pausing in its own dark, unhurried existence. The chariot crossed, the light silvered, the shadows shifted slowly as the arc progressed through its zenith and began its long, quiet descent toward the far margin, where the stone horse's neck was already beginning to bow, already beginning to carry the weight of a completed crossing, already preparing to sink toward the ocean stream that would close over the night's work until the following evening called it to begin again. On the western coast of what the Greeks called Chariot, there is a granite mountain that rises steeply above a long, still inlet of the Aegean. The mountain is called Latmus. In the ancient world, the sea came closer to its base than it does now. The inlet has silted over the centuries, and where there was once water there is now flat agricultural land, pale and quiet in the summer heat. But the mountain itself has not changed in any way that matters. Its granite flanks are worn and dark. Its upper slopes above the tree line are broken by outcroppings of stone that cast particular shadows at particular hours, and among those outcroppings there are caves, dark interiors in the rock, open to the night air, cool even in the warmest months, the kind of place where a person lying still inside would hear almost nothing but wind moving across stone. The ancient sources locate the story there. On that mountain, Inside one of those dark openings in the rock, a man named Endymion sleeps. The tradition holds that Selene descends from the sky to find him, not once and not as a single event worth describing in full. The sources approach the story from different angles, at different distances, with different degrees of explanation, and none of them presents it as something that happened once and was finished. What they preserve across the scattered margins and main texts where the myth appears is the repeated fact of her descent, the silver chariot pausing somewhere above the dark hillside, and the goddess moving from it toward the mountain below, and the man inside the cave not knowing she is coming, because the man inside the cave is always asleep. Before anything else is said about what the myth means or how many versions of it exist, it is worth dwelling on that threshold, the entrance to the cave, the dark air at the boundary between outside and inside, and the goddess standing in the space between the open sky. She travels and the closed darkness where Endymion lies. The ancient sources do not often describe that moment in detail. They tend to reach for the myth as a comparison, a shorthand, a thing already known. But the threshold is there in the structure of the story, present even when no ancient writer names it directly. The point at which a figure who moves through the whole width of the sky pauses at the narrow mouth of a cave on a granite hillside and goes in. Apollonius of Rhodes, writing in the 3rd century BCE, reaches for the Endymion story in the 4th book of the Argonautica, a long, intricate epic about Jason and the Argonauts and the journey home after the taking of the Golden Fleece. The moment Apollonius reaches for it is the moment he needs to describe what Medea feels. Medea in the Argonautica is not yet the figure of later tragedy. She is a young woman overwhelmed by a love she did not choose, and a love that has already set her against her father and her homeland and everything she has known. And the feeling Apollonius wants to convey is the feeling of being overtaken, of being moved by something too large to refuse. For that, he needs a comparison large enough. He finds it in 2 lines, Selene descending from the sky to look upon Endymion sleeping on Latmos, the longing she carries as she does so. 2 lines, no narrative, no explanation. The comparison is dropped into the poem, and the reader is expected to know exactly what it means. That casualness is itself a piece of evidence. When Apollonius uses the myth as a passing comparison in 3rd century BCE Alexandria, he is writing for an audience of readers who already hold the whole story in their heads. The descent, the cave, the sleeping man, the quality of longing, Selene feels as she crosses the air above Latmos. None of this requires setting up. It is simply already known, so well known that 2 lines are enough to invoke it completely. Whatever the myth's origin, it had reached a kind of cultural saturation by the Hellenistic period that allowed any writer to summon it with almost no words at all. The name Endymion appears in more than one ancient tradition with more than one identity attached to it, and the sources do not fully agree on who he was before he came to be the sleeping figure on Latmos. In one tradition, he is a shepherd, a young man who tends flocks on the slopes of the mountain, unremarkable in his origins, ordinary in his occupation, distinguished only by whatever quality it was that drew a goddess to descend from her nightly course, to stand above him while he slept. In a second tradition, a rather different one, he is not a shepherd at all, but a king of Elasail in the northwestern Peloponnese, which is a long distance from Caria and from Latmos, and which locates the story in an entirely different part of the Greek world. Pausanias, writing his description of Greece in the 2nd century CE, knew both traditions. He set them down side by side, noting that the Aeolian tradition gave Endymion a place in the genealogies and the royal histories of that region, while the tradition that placed him on Latmos gave him a cave, a cult, and a tomb. Pausanias did not force these two versions to resolve into one. He held them both, with the careful attention of a traveler who has seen enough variation in local traditions to know that insisting on a single correct version usually means losing something true. The question of how Endymion came to sleep, how the sleep began, and whose doing it was, is itself divided in the ancient record. One version of the story, and in some ways the most unusual one, gives the sleep to Endymion himself. In this version, it is Endymion who asks Zeus for a gift. What he asks for is immortality, but not the active, engaged immortality of the gods, not the immortality of figures who continue to do things and go places and feel the full range of what existence offers. What Endymion asks for is the long, uninterrupted sleep, the permanent rest, the arrangement in which he will never age and never wake and never be diminished by time, but will simply continue, unchanged, preserved, lying in his cave while the years move past him without touching his face. In this version, the sleep is not something done to him. It is something he chose from among all the things he could have chosen, knowing what the choice meant. There is something quietly unusual about that version of the myth. It is not the version that appears most often in the ancient sources, and it is easy to read past it in favor of the more dramatic alternatives. The alternative versions are not difficult to find. Ancient scholia, the scholarly commentaries preserved in the margins of manuscripts, the notes that ancient readers wrote beside the texts they were studying, record other possibilities. In some of these, the sleep comes from Zeus as a response to something Endymion has done, an overreach, a transgression, a crossing of a boundary that mortals were not supposed to cross. One version, preserved in ancient scholia, names the transgression as an attempt to approach Hera, Zeus's own consort, a transgression about as serious as the Greek mythological tradition could conceive of. In that version, the sleep is a punishment, or something close to it. The man in the cave is not there by his own choosing, but because a god put him there. What is striking about the version in which Endymion chooses the sleep is not that it contradicts the other versions. Variant traditions rarely concern themselves with eliminating each other, but that it shifts the nature of the arrangement entirely. A man who chose his own sleep is in a different relationship to the cave and to Selene's descents than a man who was placed there. The first Endymion asked for something and received exactly what he asked for. He made a calculation, or perhaps not a calculation, perhaps something simpler, a knowledge of himself, a recognition that what he wanted was rest and not the exhausting continuation of an active life, even through immortality. The second Endymion is a different figure, a man who reached for something he should not have reached for, and was made permanent as a consequence, frozen in sleep, the way a god with sufficient authority could freeze anything. Both versions have been held in the ancient tradition. Both have been passed on. What unites them is the figure lying in the cave on Latmos, unchanged, while Selene descends. The cave itself, in the structure of the myth, functions as a kind of container for the stillness at the story's center. A man sleeping in the open air, or sleeping in a house, or sleeping on a hillside under the stars, would be in different relationship to the sky above him. A cave encloses, a cave keeps the sleeper separate from what moves outside. Selene crosses the whole width of the night sky. That movement, that arc from the ocean stream to the far horizon, is her nightly existence, the thing she does without pause. Endymion in his cave does not cross anything. He does not move from one place to another. He lies in the dark interior of the rock and the rock holds him. There is a contrast built into the geography of the story that the ancient sources do not always name explicitly, but that is felt in the structure of every version of the myth. The goddess of perpetual motion, descending to visit the man of perfect stillness. Selene's 50 daughters appear in the scholiast on Pindar's Nemean Odes, the scholiast preserving a detail that would otherwise be lost from the main surviving texts, records that Selene and Endymion were said to have produced 50 daughters from their long arrangement. 50 daughters, the number is noted, and is not explained further, not in the way of explaining what became of them, or where they went, or whether they were present on the mountain, or scattered across the world. The 50 daughters in this tradition are primarily a number. They are primarily a way of measuring time, not a genealogy in the active sense, but something more like a count of descents, a record of how many times the goddess came down from her course and crossed the threshold of the cave, and the arrangement continued. Later ancient interpreters were attentive to the 50. The number 50, in relation to the Olympic Games, names a specific temporal interval, the 50 months that fall between one celebration of the Games and the next in the Olympiad cycle. Ancient scholars noted the coincidence or the correspondence and suggested that the 50 daughters of Selene and Endymion might be read as an allegory for those 50 months, each daughter representing one lunar month in the long cycle between games. It is the kind of interpretation that ancient scholars were drawn to, the kind that finds a structural echo between a mythological number and a calendrical one and takes the echo seriously. Whether the myth was composed with that correspondence in mind, or whether the correspondence was identified afterward and used to give the myth additional significance, is not something the surviving evidence settles. What survives is both the number 50 and the observation that 50 has a particular meaning in the rhythm of Greek civic and religious time. What is easier to feel than to analyze about the 50 daughters is the sheer duration they imply. 50 is not a small number of descents. If each daughter represents a separate visit, a separate occasion on which Selene paused her chariot above the dark mountain and descended to the cave where Endymion lay, then the myth is describing an arrangement of considerable length and considerable consistency. The goddess comes, the man sleeps, the goddess comes again. The arrangement continues in the same way it always continues, because the sleeping man does not change and does not leave and does not ask for anything to be different. Something about that persistence, its unhurried regularity, its indifference to variation, matches the rhythm of the moon itself, which returns to the same phases, in the same order, with the same patience, month after month, without the return ever feeling like urgency. The scholiast on Apollonius, and the scholiast on Theocritus, and the scholiast on Pindar, these marginal commentators, writing in the ancient world, in the margins of manuscripts they were reading and annotating, are often the primary source for variant versions of myths that would otherwise be entirely lost. The main text preserve what survived the process of selection and copying that determined which ancient works would be transmitted across the centuries. The scholia preserve what the main texts omitted or took for granted. For the Endymion myth, as for many myths that the major ancient authors approached as common knowledge, the scholia constitute an archive of alternatives, the different genealogies, the different accounts of how the sleep began, the different claims about where Endymion was from, and what happened after Selene began her descents. Reading the scholia on the Endymion myth is something like reading the footnotes to a well-known story, and finding that the footnotes contain versions of the story that are as old as the main text, and in some cases older. The ancient world produced these commentaries steadily, across the classical, Hellenistic, and later periods, as scholars read earlier texts carefully and noted what those texts assumed their readers already knew. Where Apollonius drops the Selene-Endymion comparison without explanation, the scholiast on Apollonius stops and explains. Where Pindar mentions Endymion in passing, the scholiast on Pindar fills in what Pindar did not say. Where Theocritus uses the image of Selene gazing down at the sleeping shepherd, the scholiast provides context, alternative genealogies, competing versions. The scholia are uneven in their reliability. They were written by many different hands across many centuries, and not every scholiast had access to equally good sources, but as an aggregate, they preserve a significant body of mythological material that the main surviving literary tradition did not bother to record because it was already assumed. Pausanias's engagement with the Endymion tradition is worth dwelling on because Pausanias is not a mythographer working with received stories, but a traveler working with what he saw and heard. He visited actual places. He talked to local priests and local guides. He recorded what the people living in a particular landscape said about the figures and events associated with that landscape. When he notes that there is an Endymion in Elis who is a king and a figure in royal genealogy, and also an Endymion in Chariot, whose tomb is at Heraclea under Latmos, he is not reconciling two literary traditions from his desk. He is recording what two different sets of local custodians told him about a figure both claimed as their own. The Elean tradition gave Endymion a political and dynastic role in the history of their region. The Korean tradition gave him a mountain, a cult, and a physical monument, a tomb that people could visit, and that confirmed the reality of the connection between that place and that name. What that dual tradition suggests is not contradiction, but the normal process by which mythological figures accumulate local attachment. A sleeping king turned shepherd, or a shepherd turned sleeping king, on a mountain on the edge of the Aegean. The story is old enough and resonant enough that more than one community found reason to connect it to their own landscape and their own history. The Endymion who matters for the myth of Selene is the one on Latmos, the one in the cave, the one who lies in the dark interior of the mountain while the goddess descends from the sky above. But the Elean Endymion and the Carian Endymion are not two entirely separate figures. They are the same mythological name extending across two different locations, each location claiming what it can of the story. Pausanias recording both without insisting that one of them must be wrong. The quality of Selene's attention to Endymion in the ancient sources is worth noticing. Pausanias reaches for it to describe overwhelming passion, the feeling of being moved by something larger than oneself, of wanting what one cannot approach as an ordinary exchange. The comparison Pausanias makes is between Medea's desire for Jason, which will wreck everything she has known, and Selene's longing for Endymion, which she visits in the dark while he sleeps. What these two forms of longing have in common, in Pausanias's framing, is their scale and their asymmetry. Medea loves a man who will eventually abandon her. Selene loves a man who does not wake. The comparison is not one of outcomes, but of the particular intensity of a desire that cannot be met on equal terms. The scholiast on Pindar's Nemean Odes does not describe what Selene feels when she descends to the cave. The scholiast is interested in the daughters, in the number, in the possible allegorical relationship to the Olympic cycle. Feeling is not the scholiast's subject, but the feeling is present in the structure of what the scholiast records. A goddess who descends 50 times, who keeps returning to the same cave on the same mountain, who does not stop coming, simply because the arrangement is unusual or because the man inside will never be aware of her arrival. There is a consistency in that behavior that the ancient sources treat as simply factual. This is what Selene does. This is where she goes. This is how long the arrangement has continued. The factual framing holds the feeling at a distance, but it does not eliminate it. A figure who returns 50 times to a cave where a sleeping man lies is a figure for whom that returning matters. The myth does not offer a moment of waking. None of the ancient versions of the Endymion story end with Endymion opening his eyes. The sleep in every version is permanent, not interrupted by Selene's arrival, not disturbed by the number of visits, not altered by anything the tradition records. Endymion remains in the cave on Latmos in exactly the condition the sleep placed him in, and the sleep placed him in that condition either by his own choice or by the will of Zeus. But either way, the result is the same: a man who will not age, who will not change, who will not look up. The goddess comes and goes from the cave on Latmos, as she comes and goes from the sky above it, regularly, quietly, in a rhythm that does not require the sleeping man's participation to continue. What the ancient sources preserve, in the aggregate of their different framings, is a myth about two kinds of eternity. Selene's eternity is active. She moves through the sky every night, her chariot tracing the arc from one horizon to the other, her presence illuminating the dark earth below, her existence defined by the perpetual accomplishment of that nightly crossing. Endymion's eternity is still. He lies in the cave without aging, without waking, without the kind of continuity that is made of one thing happening after another. Both figures are exempt from the ordinary process of mortal time. Both are permanent in their different ways. What the myth places between them, in the cave on the granite mountain above the still inlet of the Aegean, is the distance between those two kinds of permanence, the goddess of motion and the man of stillness, meeting in the dark, the meeting taking the form it has always taken, which is one figure arriving and the other lying precisely as he was left. The tradition preserves this myth across many centuries without ever quite explaining it, without ever settling the question of what the story is for, what it is trying to say about the nature of divine desire or mortal fate, or the specific quality of the moon's light on a sleeping face. The Scholia annotate it. Apollonius uses it. Pausanias records its geographical claims. The myth moves through the ancient textual record as a known thing, frequently invoked and rarely examined, the way very old and deeply familiar stories tend to move. There is something in that persistence worth noticing. The story of the goddess descending to the cave and the man remaining asleep inside was told and retold and assumed and annotated across more than 1,000 years of Greek and later literary culture, from the Archaic period through the late Classical, from the Hellenistic through the Imperial, without the sleeping man ever waking and without the goddess ever stopping her descents. The 50 daughters are the clearest measure of that duration. 50 is a large number of descents when each one requires the goddess to pause her nightly crossing of the sky, to bring the silver chariot to a halt above the dark mountain, to go down through the night air to the cave in the rock. 50 is a large number of occasions on which the same arrangement repeated itself in the same way: the goddess arriving, the man sleeping, the goddess returning to her course. The scholiast who preserves the number is not trying to make the persistence feel dramatic or emotionally weighted. The scholiast is recording a fact. 50 daughters. That is what the tradition says. The fact itself carries the duration, the quiet, unhurried measure of a devotion expressed not in grand singular events, but in returns, in the accumulated count of arrivals at the same dark opening, in the granite mountainside. The moon was rising over Latmos on all of those nights. That is not a detail the ancient sources needed to state, because it was simply true. The moon rises on every night over every mountain as a matter of the world's ordinary operation, but it is worth holding in the context of this story. The same body of light that Selene drives as her chariot rising above the same mountain, on the slope of which the same man lies, sleeping in the same cave, and the goddess pausing in her ark to descend to him and returning to the ark when she is done, the ark continuing, the mountain continuing, the man in the cave continuing, unchanged. The scholiast on Pindar's Nemean Odes writes the number 50 and moves on. Pausanias records the Elean and Carian traditions without choosing between them. Apollonius uses the myth to describe Medea's overwhelming desire and returns to his narrative of the Argonauts without looking back. None of them lingers. The myth was old enough by the time each of them reached it that it did not require their lingering. It was simply there, a known fact about a goddess and a sleeping man, a granite mountain and a dark cave, and the repeated fact of a descent that the count of 50 daughters makes legible as a temporal reality. 50 nights of returning, 50 mornings of going back. The man inside, unchanged at every one of them, lying still in the cave, while outside the mountain remained exactly as it had been when Selene first came down from the sky to find him sleeping there. At the start of a new month, before first light had fully settled on the city, someone would set out an offering. The object placed on the small household altar might be a handful of barley, or a portion of frankincense, or simply a lamp lit at the threshold between the interior dark and the air outside. This was the Nomenia, the first day of the Greek lunar month, marked in many communities by offerings made to Apollo, to Selene, and to the gods of the household. It was not an elaborate ceremony. It did not require a priest. What it required was attention to the moon and a willingness to acknowledge at the turning point of a new cycle that something had passed and something was beginning. The Greek lunisolar calendar organized time by the progression of the moon through its phases, and every Greek community lived inside that rhythm, whether they thought carefully about it or not. Each month was determined by the lunar cycle of approximately 29 to 30 days, with full months of 30 days alternating with hollow months of 29, a structure that meant the moon's face was the primary clock of religious time across the Greek world. Sacrifices were scheduled by it, markets were regulated by it, festivals fell on particular days of the month, whose significance was calibrated against where the moon stood in its cycle. The 15th of the month, when the moon was full, held its own character. The last days, as the moon thinned toward disappearance, held another, and the Nomenia, that first day when the new crescent appeared in the western sky, just after sunset, thin as a wire against the darkening air, held the particular quality of threshold, the month not yet shaped, the days still open. In the oldest layers of Greek religious practice, the connection between Selene and the moon was not primarily a matter of stories. It was a matter of time itself. The month was hers in the most concrete sense, not because a myth said so, but because the month was measured by the body she drove across the sky, and the bodies that make time shape the way communities worship. To honor the new moon was, in one of its oldest meanings, to honor the goddess whose light defined when the month began and when it ended. The Numenia offering was not directed toward a story. It was directed toward a cycle. The city of Athens organized its festivals with considerable precision against the lunar calendar, and the months themselves carried names connected to the religious events that defined them: Hekatombion, Metagatnion, Bodidromion, month after month, each named for a festival, each festival falling on its prescribed day within the moon's arc from new to full and back to dark. What this meant in practice was that the moon's phases were not merely observed but inhabited. A community's entire ceremonial life was structured around attending to them, and the goddess who embodied the moon was woven into that structure not as a figure one visited occasionally, but as a presence whose cycle everyone tracked, whether or not they gave it theological elaboration. Selene was in the calendar the way weather is in the sky, present whether named or not, shaping everything that had to be planned around it. The evidence for Selene's worship in specific sacred sites is uneven across the ancient record, as it is for many goddesses whose primary domain was cyclical and atmospheric rather than dramatically narratable. Pausanias, writing in the 2nd century CE, his wide-ranging description of Greece places Selene's worship within the cultic landscape of Thelpusa in Arcadia. Arcadia, the mountainous interior of the Peloponnese, had a reputation in antiquity for preserving forms of religious practice that more urbanized regions had long since modified or abandoned. Its sanctuaries included cults of unusual character, Demeter with archaic associations, Poseidon in mountain contexts far from any sea, chthonic figures whose names appear nowhere else in the wider Greek tradition. Thelpusa sat within this landscape, a place where the older shapes of Greek religion persisted in the relative quiet of an interior valley, and Pausanias mentions Selene there with the matter-of-fact brevity he uses for cults that were simply present, simply ongoing, requiring no special explanation. Arcadia was not Selene's only cultic home, but there is something appropriate about her appearing in that particular region's record. The moon is not primarily an urban presence. Cities absorb its light into the competing glow of lamps and hearths, and the general warm haze of human habitation gathered together. In an open mountain valley, in the kind of landscape Arcadia offered, the moon's qualities, its capacity to cast shadows at night, to turn stone silver, to make the difference between a navigable path and a black and formless hillside, were practical realities rather than poetic figures. A community that lived with that landscape in an intimate way would have reasons to honor the body whose light made the difference, and Helphusa's religious conservatism may simply reflect the fact that where the moon still mattered directly, the goddess whose presence it embodied was honored with corresponding directness. The act of worship itself leaves fewer traces than the literature. What survives of Greek lunar cult is largely incidental. A mention here, a scholiast's note there, the occasional passing reference in a travel account, or a treatise on calendrical reckoning. The material for reconstruction is thinner than one might hope, but one body of ancient writing provides an unusual level of detail about lunar veneration, and that is the collection of texts known as the Papyri Graeci Magicae, the Greek magical papyri, a body of Greco-Egyptian documents dated roughly from the 2nd century BCE through the 5th century CE, preserving a tradition of lunar invocation that was practical, specific, and attentive to the details of what a ritual required. These texts are not liturgical records from a state cult. They are working documents preserved in the dry climate of Egypt, belonging to a religious practice that operated in the space between official cult and private devotion. The lunar invocations in the papyri specify offerings with notable precision. Frankincense features prominently, the resin that burns slowly, that releases its scent in pale curling threads into the night air, that was associated across the ancient Mediterranean with the presence of the divine in ways that crossed cultural boundaries with unusual consistency. Honey was prescribed alongside it in several texts, its sweetness and its association with preservation and care, making it a fitting offering at a nocturnal threshold. White flowers, the papyri specify the color, were arranged as part of the ritual context, their whiteness perhaps carrying the same resonance as the white horses of the traditional chariot image, an alignment between offering and the light one was invoking. These are the specific details of how someone, somewhere in the Greco-Egyptian world, across those several centuries, would have gone about seeking Selene's attention, standing at night with a small fire burning, a dish of honey set out, white flowers arranged nearby, frankincense releasing its pale smoke into the air. This was not an act requiring institutional authorization. It was a domestic and personal form of the attention the Numenia offering represented at the civic scale. Both were grounded in the same understanding that the moon had a presence that could be addressed, and that addressing it required appropriate materials and appropriate timing. The timing, as always, came from the moon's own cycle. Certain invocations in the papyri specify what phase of the moon was most suitable for a given purpose. The full moon for one kind of request, the waxing moon for another, the dark of the moon for requests whose character matched the qualities of that particular phase. The moon's cycle was not just a backdrop to these rituals, it was the framework within which they became possible. Selene's presence in these later Greco-Egyptian texts arrives surrounded by other associations that had accumulated over centuries. Her connection to Artemis, to Hecate, to the moon goddess known in the Roman world as Luna, to figures from Egyptian religious tradition whose attributes overlapped with hers in the syncretic environment of the Hellenistic and Roman periods. The papyri are not always careful to distinguish between these figures. In many of the lunar invocations, Selene, Hecate, and Artemis are addressed as a single entity, or as three names for the same divine power, the boundaries between them deliberately blurred in favor of a comprehensive lunar force that carried attributes from all three traditions at once. This blurring was a feature of the religious environment in which the papyri were produced, a world where Greek, Egyptian, Near Eastern, and Roman religious traditions had been in contact for long enough that their boundaries had become genuinely permeable, especially at the edges of official cult, where private practice had more room to move. The island of Rhodes held a form of lunar and solar reverence that was more institutionally bounded than anything in the magical papyri. Helios was the patron deity of Rhodes in the clearest and most public sense. The Colossus of Rhodes, the enormous bronze figure of the sun god that stood at the entrance to the harbor, was one of the ancient world's most recognized monuments, a declaration of the island's identification with solar divinity, visible from the sea to any approaching ship. The Colossus was erected in the early 3rd century BCE, following the successful defense of the island against Demetrius Poliorcetes, and it stood for approximately 54 years before an earthquake brought it down, around 226 BCE. Even fallen, it remained famous. Ancient authors described visitors traveling to see the prostrate bronze figure lying on the ground, still enormous, still remarkable in its scale. What the Rhodian tradition preserved alongside this prominent solar devotion was a complementary reverence for Selene as Helios' sister and celestial counterpart. The siblings formed a pair in the Rhodian religious imagination that reflected their relationship in the theogonic genealogy, the children of Hyperion and Thea, the sun and the moon, each governing their half of the day's cycle. This pairing was woven into the island's public identity in a way that gave Selene a real institutional presence alongside her more visually spectacular brother. The Colossus drew all the attention, as large public monuments tend to do, but the lunar sister was honored within the same cultic environment. her identity as the sun's complement, given a specificity of place and community that the more diffuse evidence of the calendrical tradition could not quite match. There is a difference between a goddess honored in the rhythm of the calendar and a goddess honored in a specific place with specific practices, and the Rhodian evidence reflects both levels of Selene's presence in ancient religious life. The calendar honored her by structuring time around her cycles. The sanctuary honored her by designating a place where her presence could be addressed directly, where offerings had a physical location to accumulate and a specific community to maintain them. Both forms of honor were real. Both gave the goddess a different kind of weight in the lives of the people practicing them. The calendar was inescapable. Every Athenian or Spartan or Corinthian who scheduled a wedding or a market day or a sacrifice was acknowledging the moon's authority over time, whether they invoked Selene by name or not. The sanctuary was chosen, an act of deliberate orientation toward a specific divine presence, made by a community that had decided this was the appropriate direction of their attention. The question of how to hold Selene's identity in classical antiquity is more complicated than it first appears, because the syncretic processes that eventually merged Selene with Artemis and with the Roman Luna were not sudden or uniform. They were gradual, uneven, and proceeded at different rates in different parts of the ancient world and at different levels of religious practice. The classical era sources, 5th and 4th century BCE, Athenian tragedy, the Hesiodic material, the earlier lyric tradition, generally preserve Selene, Artemis, and Hecate as separate figures with distinct domains and distinct cultic identities. Artemis hunted in the world of the living and was associated with wilderness, with transitions between states, with childbirth, and the vulnerable moments at the edges of human life. Hecate presided over crossroads, thresholds, and the boundary zones between the human world and those regions beyond it where ordinary rules did not apply. Selene drove the moon through the sky. These were not the same goddess. A 5th century Athenian watching a tragedy in which Artemis appeared would not have seen her as interchangeable with Selene. The traditions were in contact, and the moon was part of the landscape within which Artemis hunted, a nocturnal figure in some of her aspects, associated with silver light in some of her imagery, but the identification was not yet complete. Selene had her own hymns. Her genealogy placed her among the Titans' children, not among the Olympians. Her mythological identity was ancient and specific, and the tradition preserved it with reasonable consistency through the classical period. What the scholarly consensus now holds, following the work of figures such as Walter Burkert on Greek religion, is that the syncretic identification of Selene with Artemis was a Hellenistic development, a product of the period following Alexander's conquests, when Greek culture spread across a wider world and Greek religion was forced into contact with other theological systems in ways that accelerated the internal process of theological consolidation. The Hellenistic world was one of enormous religious mixing. Greek settlers in Egypt encountered a tradition in which the moon goddess Isis carried attributes that could be mapped, partially and imperfectly, onto Greek Selene. Greek communities in Syria and Anatolia found themselves adjacent to religious traditions that included prominent lunar deities whose imagery overlapped with Selene's crescent diadem and nocturnal character. The pressure to find equivalences, to say that this goddess and that goddess were the same divine power, known by different names, was not cynical or dismissive of either tradition. It was a serious theological project, an attempt to make sense of the divine in a world that had suddenly become much larger and much more varied than it had previously seemed. But the project inevitably blurred lines that the earlier tradition had maintained, and among those blurred lines was the distinction between Selene, Artemis, and the various lunar figures with whom she was identified over the course of several centuries. Roman religious practice added another layer. Luna, the Roman moon goddess, had her own cultic history, a temple on the Aventine Hill, a chariot tradition that paralleled the Greek image, a presence in the Roman lunar calendar that shared structural similarities with the Greek Numenia tradition. When Roman writers encountered the Greek Selene, they brought her into alignment with Luna, and the identification ran sufficiently deep that Latin authors sometimes used the names interchangeably in the way they used Helios and Sol, or Ares and Mars. The identification was not total or without tension. Scholars working in the Roman period were capable of noting that the traditions had distinct histories and that the theological equivalence was a product of deliberate alignment rather than original identity. But for most practical and literary purposes, Selene and Luna became two names for the same presence, and the accretion of the Roman tradition around the Greek figure added further material to the growing composite. Within the Roman world, the image of Selene Luna appeared on a material object of enormous cultural significance, the sarcophagus. Marble sarcophagi produced in Rome and throughout the empire from roughly the 2nd century CE onward frequently depicted Selene's descent to the sleeping Endymion as a central scene, using the myth as a visual and theological resource for the bereaved. The logic was not obscure. A myth about a mortal who sleeps eternally while a goddess watches over him in the dark carried obvious relevance for a culture trying to make sense of death and the long sleep of the dead. The sarcophagi now held in the Capitoline museums and the Palazzo al Tempes in Rome show Selene with her robes billowing around her, the crescent diadem above her brow, descending from her chariot toward the sleeping figure below. These were objects carved for the grief of the living and for the comfort of the long resting, placed in the darkness of a tomb where they would be seen, if at all, only by those who came to pay their respects. The crescent above Selene's head on these carvings is the same identifying attribute she wore on Attic red figure vase painting from the 5th century BCE, the same thin arc that had become her distinguishing mark across 6 centuries of Greek and Roman artistic production. The image was stable in a way that much of ancient religious iconography was not. Selene could be recognized at a glance because of that curve above her brow, and the recognition carried with it everything the tradition had accumulated around her: the chariot, the horses, the nocturnal journey, the connection to the moon's cycle, and the month's rhythm. A grieving Roman family commissioning a sarcophagus did not need the myth explained. The image was sufficient. The crescent meant Selene, and Selene meant the moon, and the moon continued crossing the sky above the tomb the way it had always crossed it, regardless of what lay below. The persistence of that image, the crescent, the descent, the sleeping figure, across such an extended period of time, reflects something genuine about the way the moon maintains its presence in human experience, even as the theological frameworks surrounding it change substantially. The Selene honored at the Numenia in 5th century BCE Athens was not quite the same figure as the Luna of the Aventine temple, and the Luna of the Aventine was not quite the same as the composite lunar goddess addressed in the Greek magical papyri. But the continuity of the crescent image, the continuity of the chariot, the continuity of the name Selene, across even the periods of most active syncretism, these suggest that whatever was primary in the tradition was robust enough to survive its accumulated elaborations without disappearing into them. The goddess who drove the moon across the sky was still recognizable as the same goddess across a span of centuries that saw the religious world around her change considerably. What modern scholars attempting to recover Selene's pre-Hellenistic identity have to work with is a record that requires patient reading backward. The classical sources preserve her more distinctly, but even there, the figure is seen in part through what she would later become. The Hesiodic material places her in her oldest genealogical context, as the daughter of Hyperion and Thea, the sister of Helios and Eos, the child of the Titans rather than the Olympians. This positioning is ancient and consistent. The Homeric hymns give her a voice of sorts, a vehicle for description, a figure whose journey can be hymned in the traditional form. The scholiasts and the doxographers preserve variant traditions that the main literary texts assume without stating. And the material culture, the vase paintings, the relief sculptures, the Parthenon pediment, shows what the visual tradition held as primary when the myth was rendered in physical form. Reading through these layers toward an earlier Selene requires something like archaeological care. The later identifications are not wrong exactly. They reflect real processes of theological development that were meaningful to the communities that carried them out. But they are also additions, and under them, visible in the oldest sources, if the reader knows where to look, is the Selene who exists before the additions, the daughter of Thea, whose name means divine, and Hyperion, whose name marks him as the one who goes above. The Selene, who is listed in Hesiod's Theogony at lines 371 through 374, alongside her siblings, in the spare genealogical diction of the earliest Greek theological writing. The Selene, for whom the Numenia offering was set out at the beginning of each new month, not because her myth was being retold, but because her cycle was beginning again, and the beginning of a cycle deserved acknowledgement. The acknowledgement was simple: an offering placed on an altar, a lamp lit at a threshold, a dish of honey set out in the night air, alongside a portion of frankincense, its smoke rising slowly in the dark, white flowers arranged nearby, as though the white of the flowers carried the same quality as the white of the light they were placed beneath. These things were not grand. They did not require a poet to describe them or a philosopher to interpret their significance. They were small acts of attention directed at a large and ongoing fact. The moon was completing its cycle, the month was beginning, and the goddess whose presence the moon embodied was worth acknowledging at the turning point. The Greek communities that practiced the Numenia were not thinking primarily about Endymion or about the silver chariot or about the genealogical relationship between Selene and her Titan parents. They were thinking about the month ahead and what it required and what form of acknowledgement was appropriate at its opening. The myth and the theology were present in the background, inherited, assumed, part of the framework within which the ritual had its meaning, but the foreground was domestic and practical. A family at the start of a new month, an offering made at dawn, the crescent of the new moon just visible in the western sky the evening before, thin and faint, confirming that the month had turned. This is what it looked like for Selene to be a living religious presence rather than a literary one, not the grand Homeric hymn, though the hymn existed, not the Parthenon pediment, though the pediment stood, but the small fire at the threshold, and the ordinary attention of a community that had built the lunar cycle into the structure of its time. The moon's phases were not available to ignore. They marked the calendar with a regularity that could not be argued with, and in marking it, they kept the goddess present in a way that required no special effort of religious imagination, only the effort of noticing, month after month, that the cycle was continuing, that the light was changing, that the new crescent had appeared, and the old month was done. The layers that accumulated over Selene's older identity, the Hellenistic syncretisms, the Roman identifications, the gradual merging with Artemis and Luna, and the composite lunar figure of the magical papyri, were not erage. They were elaborations. Underneath them, the older figure remains accessible to anyone patient enough to look. She is there in Hesiod's genealogical lines. She is there in the structural logic of the Numenia. She is there in the conservative religious landscape of Arcadia, where Thelpisa honored her within a cultic environment that had preserved archaic forms more faithfully than most. She is there in the crescent image that appeared on Attic vases in the 5th century BCE and was still being carved onto Roman sarcophagi 6 centuries later, the attribute so consistent that it functioned as a signature across an extraordinary span of time. Modern scholars approaching Selene's pre-Hellenistic identity find themselves working the way a careful reader works through a manuscript that has been annotated for centuries, each generation of readers leaving marginal notes that comment on the text, extend it, reinterpret it, and sometimes obscure it. The notes are interesting in their own right. They reflect the theological concerns of the communities that made them, but the text itself is still there if the reader returns to it, and the figure in the oldest lines of that text is the one who holds the thread that connects everything that came after. The daughter of Thea and Hyperion, older than the Olympian order, her domain written into the structure of time itself, her presence marked at the opening of every month by those who knew which direction to face when the new light appeared in the evening sky. The Numenia offering made at the start of a new month was, in this sense, not a sophisticated theological act. It did not require the practitioner to hold the whole of Selene's genealogy and mythology in mind while setting out the barley or lighting the lamp. It required only the basic act of orientation that the lunar calendar made inevitable, turning toward the cycle as it turned, acknowledging the threshold, and placing something of value at the point where one month ended and another had begun. The theology was already built into the structure of the month. The ritual was simply the gesture that made the structure visible, and the structure continues. The lunar cycle that defined the Greek month still runs with the same precision. The same phases, new moon, waxing crescent, first quarter, gibbous, full, waning, last quarter, dark, recur in the same sequence with the same periodicity they had when the Numenia was observed in 5th century BCE Athens. The calendar that housed them has changed many times over in the centuries since, as one system of time reckoning replaced another, and the lunar and solar cycles were reconciled in new and different ways. But the moon's face itself has not changed. The crescent that appeared in the western sky the evening before the Numenia appears in the same position, with the same thin brightness, at the same point in the cycle, whenever the month turns now. Selene's pre-Hellenistic identity, the figure that exists in the oldest layers of the tradition before the syncretic identifications accumulated around her, is perhaps best held not as a theological proposition, but as an attentiveness to what the moon actually does, the way it measures time, the way it changes the character of night, the way its cycle divides the month into phases that feel qualitatively distinct to anyone who lives outdoors enough to notice them. The theology is a way of naming and honoring an attentiveness that the cycle made natural, and the oldest traces of Selene, set down in Hesiod's dactylic hexameter and preserved in the quiet conservatism of Arcadian cults and Rhodian sibling veneration, are traces of that attentiveness in its most direct form, a community's recognition that the light moving across the sky at night was worth paying attention to, and that what was worth paying attention to deserved a name. The scholars who work backward through the accumulated layers of Hellenistic and Roman theology to find that earlier figure are engaged in the same patient attention at a different scale, reading carefully enough to distinguish the annotation from the text, the elaboration from the thing it elaborated, the later identifications from the distinct and older presence underneath. What they find, when they look, is still there. The daughter of Hyperion and Thea, sister of Helios and Eos, listed in the Theogony, in the oldest surviving work of Greek theological writing, the goddess for whom the Numenia offering was set out at the start of each new month in communities across the Greek world, from Athens to Arcadia to the island where the colossus of her brother stood in the harbor, facing out to sea. The figure whose crescent diadem was still being added to marble sarcophagi in Rome centuries after the tradition that first gave her that attribute had passed through so many hands that its original character was almost unreachable. Still there, still recognizable, the crescent still above her brow, the cycle still running as it had always run, the new month still beginning when the thin light appeared in the evening sky to the west. Anaxagoras stood in Athens in the middle of the 5th century BCE and said that the moon was a stone, not a goddess, not a silver light riding its own fire through the sky, a large stone or a mass of earthy matter catching the light of the sun and throwing it back down toward the earth, cold, borrowed, reflected. The city around him was the same city where Selene's silver chariot was still a fully inhabited image, where the moon's monthly progress through the sky was a religious fact woven into the structure of every Greek calendar, where priests still set out offerings at the new moon's arrival. And here was this man from Clazomenae, working quietly in his house in Athens, arriving at the specific and quietly startling proposal that the light up there had no source of its own. Two understandings of the same moon occupied the same city at the same time, and the city managed to hold both of them without particular distress, because the world is large enough to carry within it a great number of explanations for the same shining thing in the sky. The sources for what Anaxagoras argued are not his own surviving works, since almost nothing of his writing has come down to us intact. What persists are summaries made by later writers, the doxographers, the collectors of philosophical opinions, figures such as Hippolytus and Aetius, who made it their work to gather and preserve what the earlier thinkers had held. From these summaries, a general picture survives. Anaxagoras had proposed that the moon was a body with mass and substance, not a luminous being moving by its own nature, and that its light was the sun's light returned. This was, in its own historical moment, a remarkable thing to set down. The sun was also, in his account, not a chariot of fire driven by a divine figure, but something like a large incandescent stone, a mass of metal or rock, heated to brilliance by whatever it had passed through on its way into position. These claims were preserved in Athens, eventually, as charges of impiety. The city that could hold two understandings of the moon simultaneously was also the city that could decide one of them had gone too far. What is worth holding for a moment is the quality of the idea itself, in its time, in that specific place. Athens in the 5th century BCE was a city where the goddess Selene was a real presence in the religious imagination, not a metaphor and not a pleasant fiction kept around for artistic purposes. The image of the moon as a divine figure crossing the sky in her silver chariot was as alive for an educated Athenian as the idea of the sun as a bronze disk of earthy matter was new and strange. Anaxagoras did not disprove the chariot or dissolve the goddess. He placed beside her a second image, one that would take many more centuries to gain the kind of authority that eventually made the others seem like something else. In his own time, the stone and the chariot coexisted. The moon kept moving. People kept watching it from below. The particular quality of the moon's light was something ancient observers of all kinds could agree on, the fact that it changed. Not merely that it rose and set like the sun, or that it traveled across the same broad arc of sky, but that from one night to the next it showed a different face, a thin edge of silver against the dark, a half circle of light, a full luminous disk, then the gradual return to almost nothing. This cycle, approximately 29.5 days from new moon to new moon, had been observed and measured and counted with some precision long before Anaxagoras arrived in Athens. The Babylonians had records of lunar cycles going back centuries before the Greeks were building temples on the Acropolis. But within the Greek mathematical tradition, the measurement of the moon's cycle was refined over time to a degree of accuracy that in retrospect is extraordinary. Meton of Athens, working in the 5th century BCE, made a discovery about the relationship between the lunar cycle and the solar year that became one of the most practically useful astronomical findings of the ancient world. The moon's monthly cycle does not divide evenly into the solar year. 12 lunar months fall short of one solar year by about 11 days, which means a purely lunar calendar drifts steadily through the solar seasons, arriving eventually at a situation where the months that were supposed to correspond to summer fall in winter, and the spring festivals slide into autumn. Many ancient cultures found their own ways to manage this mismatch. Meton found something more elegant, that 235 lunar months align almost exactly with 19 solar years. Not perfectly, there is a small remainder even there, but close enough that after 19 years, the same phase of the moon falls on the same day of the solar calendar as it did at the beginning. The full moon that rose on a particular night would rise again on the same calendar night, 19 years later, give or take a matter of hours. This was called, later, the Metonic cycle, and it was used for centuries as the basis for synchronizing Greek lunisolar calendars with the solar year. For a religious world organized around the monthly phases of the moon, the new moon, the full moon, the specific numbered days of the month that carried their associated rituals and prohibitions, this kind of long-range predictability was not merely a mathematical satisfaction. It was a practical instrument, a way of knowing in advance what the moon would be doing on any given night, 19 years hence, and then 19 years after that. The cycle was engraved on the walls of some ancient public buildings, set in stone as a civic and religious tool. Meton reportedly made his announcement of the cycle in 432 BCE at the summer solstice, at a moment chosen to connect the solar and lunar reckonings at their most significant point. The city noted it. The calendar makers used it. The moon continued its 19-year patterns with or without being observed. Hipparchus of Nicaea, working in the 2nd century BCE, carried the measurement further. Hipparchus is one of the most significant figures in the history of Greek astronomy, and the loss of most of his own works is a genuine gap in what has survived from that period. What is known of his methods and conclusions comes largely from Ptolemy's Almagest, written 3 centuries after Hipparchus lived and worked, which preserves a substantial account of his findings. What Hipparchus achieved, among a long list of careful and painstaking accomplishments, was a determination of the lunar synodic month, the precise time from one new moon to the next new moon, that was accurate to within a very small margin of the modern accepted value. The modern accepted figure is 29 days, 12 hours, 44 minutes, and approximately 3 seconds. Hipparchus arrived at a figure that differs from this by something on the order of less than a second per month. a margin so small that it is still the kind of number one says aloud and then pauses over. The method Hipparchus used combined his own systematic observations with older Babylonian records going back several centuries before his own time. By comparing the timing of lunar eclipses recorded in Babylonian astronomical diaries with eclipses, he could observe himself from his position at Nicaea or Rhodes. He could identify patterns in the lunar motion over very long baselines of time. The longer the baseline, the more precisely the average rate of motion could be calculated. It was not a single brilliant observation that produced his figure for the synodic month, but the accumulated weight of many observations across a long period, measured against an even longer archive of recorded observations made in Mesopotamia. The moon in this account was being watched from two ends of a very long corridor of time, and the measurements taken at each end were being brought into conversation with one another. There is something specifically quiet about the image of Hipparchus working in the 2nd century BCE, consulting records made by Babylonian astronomers who had been dead for 150 years, and calculating the motion of a body they had all been looking at from different sides of the same sea of sky. The moon does not change in these centuries. Its synodic month is the same in 700 BCE as it is in 150 BCE, as it is now. What changes is the length of the record, the accumulated weight of careful watching, the number of cycles that have been counted and set down. Hipparchus arrived at his number because enough people before him had been paying attention long enough to give him the raw material of a calculation that would otherwise have required waiting out centuries more. The work was collaborative in a way that no single author's name could fully represent, and Hipparchus himself seems to have known this, citing his Babylonian sources with something that reads, in Ptolemy's account, like genuine acknowledgement. Aristotle, working in the 4th century BCE, was less interested in measuring the moon than in understanding its cosmological position, its place in the structure of the universe as a whole. In his model of the cosmos, as developed across the Decalogue and the Meteorologica, the universe was divided into two fundamentally different realms. Below the moon was the sublunary world, the world of change, decay, generation, and dissolution, the world of the four elements, earth, water, fire, and air, cycling through one another, combining and separating, making and unmaking the things of ordinary experience. Above the moon was the superlunary world, composed not of the four elements, but of a fifth substance, aether, eternal and unchanging, in which the stars and planets moved in their perfect circular paths without alteration or decay. The moon sat at the boundary between these two realms, and it was the lowest of the celestial bodies, the closest to the terrestrial world, and its position at the threshold between the mutable and the eternal gave it a cosmological significance that went beyond its role in regulating the calendar. In Aristotle's framework, the moon was the hinge on which the two orders of existence turned. Everything below it was subject to the law of change. Everything above it was exempt from that law. The moon itself, sitting exactly on that line, belonged to both and neither, a celestial body subject to the same circular motion as the stars, composed of the same aether that made their permanence possible, and yet also the body whose phases and cycles were most visible from below, most entangled with the ordinary world of time and weather and growing things. Later ancient thinkers made considerable use of this Aristotelian boundary. The idea of the soul descending through the lunar sphere on its way into embodiment, or ascending back through it on its way out, became a significant motif in Neoplatonic and later ancient religious thought. The moon as threshold, as the place where two kinds of existence met, was a cosmological image with a long afterlife in the ancient world. It sat comfortably alongside the mythological image of Selene as a figure who moved between the divine and the mortal, arriving at a cave where a sleeping man lay, descending from the eternal order of the sky into the particular and changeable world of human sleep. The theological structure Aristotle provided and the mythological image the poets preserved were at a certain angle, describing the same intuition about the moon, that it occupied a position unlike anything else in the sky, belonging fully to neither world.
Choice between two different kinds of time. The Milky Way appears in Aristotle's meteorological writings as a feature he attempts to account for within his cosmological model, suggesting it is an atmospheric phenomenon rather than a stellar one, a conclusion that was incorrect, but that reflects the seriousness with which he applied his framework to every observable feature of the sky. His moon was not the moon of measurement and cycle that Hipparchus would later map with such precision.
It was the moon of structure, a pivot around which the entire architecture of the cosmos organized itself. To be at the boundary was, in Aristotle's framework, to be at the most cosmologically significant place in the structure of things. The moon held that position by definition, and nothing in the model could quite replace it. Plutarch wrote his dialogue on the face and the moon, the De Facie in Orbi Lunae, in the late 1st or early 2nd century CE, sometime in the period when he was producing the bulk of his philosophical and biographical work from his home in Chaeronea in Boeotia. It is a conversation set within a dialogue form, the kind of text that allows multiple positions to be given voice and explored without any single one being declared definitively correct, a mode of philosophical writing that Plutarch used with considerable sophistication across many of his works. The De Facie is among the most unusual of them because its subject is a specific observable feature of the moon, the dark patches visible on its surface, the regions that later generations would call the Maria, the seas, the lunar highlands and lowlands, and its central question is what those patches are and what they imply about the nature of the moon as a physical body. One of the speakers in the dialogue argues that the visible markings on the moon's face are caused by differences in the surface, that the dark areas are depressions, valleys, lowlands, and that the brighter regions are elevations, mountains, and higher ground, and that the contrast between them is produced by the way light and shadow fall differently across an irregular surface. This is stripped of the dialogue frame and the philosophical context, a claim strikingly close to what Galileo would observe through his telescope and describe in the Sidereus Nuncius in 1610, the lunar surface as a terrain of mountains and valleys, casting real shadows, not the smooth luminous body that the traditional model of the superlunary realm implied. Plutarch's dialogue speaker was not making this claim on the basis of a telescope. The telescope did not exist in 100 CE. The claim was based on careful naked eye observation of the moon's disk, on reasoning about how light behaves on uneven surfaces, and on a willingness to extend the logic of terrestrial experience to a celestial body that Aristotelian cosmology placed firmly outside the realm of terrestrial rules. Galileo read Plutarch. He owned a copy of the De Facie, and the claim his dialogue speaker had made about the lunar surface was available to any careful reader of Plutarch's text for 15 centuries before the Sidereus Nuncius was written. The same observation, made from the same surface of the earth, looking up at the same moon, but separated by those 15 centuries of intervening silence, the observation living in Plutarch's text without the instrument to confirm it, waiting for a lens ground in a workshop in the Netherlands to arrive in the hands of a man in Padua who would point it at the sky on a clear night in 1609 and see the mountains and valleys that Plutarch's speaker had described as possibilities 1,500 years before. The moon's face did not change between Plutarch and Galileo. The mountains were there in both cases. The shadows they cast across the lunar surface were falling in both centuries, on every clear night that anyone cared to look. There is something specifically worth dwelling in about the texture of Plutarch's dialogue as a form of knowledge-making. It is not a treatise that arrives at conclusions. It is a conversation in which several well-read and thoughtful people sit together and argue about a feature of the visible sky. One speaker defends the traditional cosmological view, in which the moon cannot have a rough and varied surface because the ether of which it is composed is incapable of the kind of irregular formation that produces mountains and valleys on Earth. Another speaker offers the observation-based argument about light and shadow. Other positions are given voice and explored. The dialogue does not resolve. The conversation continues. Plutarch seems comfortable with that, with the idea that careful people looking at the same object from the same world could arrive at different conclusions about its nature, and that the disagreement itself was a form of serious engagement with something genuinely difficult. The moon as it appears in the Dephisi is a body that has become, by Plutarch's time, the object of a very long tradition of careful looking. Anaxagoras had called it a stone in the 5th century BCE. Meton had mapped its cycle in the same century. Aristotle had placed it at the boundary of the cosmos in the 4th century BCE. Hipparchus had measured its monthly period to within a second in the 2nd century BCE. By the time Plutarch was writing his dialogue in the 1st or 2nd century CE, the moon had been the subject of philosophical, mathematical, and observational attention for at least 5 centuries within the Greek tradition, and far longer than that in the Babylonian records that Greek astronomers had learned to consult. The question of what the face of the moon looked like, what made those dark patches dark, what caused the uneven distribution of light and shadow across the disk, was not a new question when Plutarch asked it. It was a very old question, being asked again, with all the accumulated resources of a long tradition of people who had taken it seriously. The dark patches themselves, the lunar maria, are ancient. They were formed by volcanic activity that ended billions of years ago, by the flooding of large impact basins with lava that cooled and solidified into the flat, darker basaltic plains that cover them today. They are old in a way that makes the human history of watching them from below seem, in perspective, brief. The moon that Anaxagoras looked at was the same moon. The moon that Meton counted was the same moon. The moon that Hipparchus measured, that Aristotle placed at the boundary of his cosmos, that Plutarch's dialogue speakers argued about in a room in Charonea. The same moon, with the same maria, the same mountains in the same positions, the same shadows falling at the same angles whenever the sun's light arrived at the same oblique degree. The face of the moon has not changed in any way that a human observer could detect in the span of time that separates Anaxagoras from Plutarch. It has not changed in any way that a human observer could detect in the span of time that separates Plutarch from now. This is one of the things that makes the moon as a subject specifically suited to the kind of attention that very old traditions bring to bear on the sky. The river a Greek poet described is not the same river. The mountain in an ancient account may have eroded beyond recognition. The forest is gone, or the city is gone, or the harbor has silted up, and what was once an inlet is now a marsh or a field. But the face of the moon in Plutarch's dialogue is the same face visible tonight. When the dialogue speaker describes the dark regions as valleys casting the shadows of their own depths, the valleys he is describing are still there. The shadow of Mare Imbrium, the shadow of Mare Serenitatis, the shadow of Oceanus Procellarum, they are falling right now at the angle appropriate to this night's illumination, exactly as they were falling on whatever clear night it was in Charonea, when Plutarch looked up and began to wonder what was causing the pattern. The Homeric hymn to Selene, composed in a period that scholars generally place somewhere between the 7th and 4th centuries BCE, describes mortals on the earth below looking upward as her silver light brightens the dark air, silvering the landscape, casting its particular quality of illumination across everything beneath her arc. The hymn is interested in the effect of the light as experienced from below, the change it makes in the visible world, the way it arrives on a dark night and redefines what can be seen. This is not so far from what Plutarch's dialogue speakers were doing, in their way looking up at the same body, asking what it was, trying to understand the relationship between what was happening up there and what was being received down here. The questions changed. The hymn asked, "What is the goddess doing as she crosses the sky?" Plutarch's dialogue asked, "What is the physical surface of that body, and what does that surface do with the light it receives?" The looking is continuous. The moon above both questions is the same. Aristotle's boundary between the mutable and the eternal placed the moon at the most philosophically interesting position in the cosmos. Everything below it was subject to time. Everything above it was outside of time, in the sense that nothing up there changed or decayed. The moon, sitting on that boundary, was the last body that could be reached, in any sense, by the forces that operate in the sublunary world. In the Neoplatonic tradition that developed after Aristotle, this boundary became the place through which souls passed on their way in and out of embodied existence, descending through the lunar sphere into the density of matter, ascending back through it on their return to the pure realm above. The moon was not merely a phase marker or a calendar regulator or a stone reflecting someone else's fire. It was the doorway, the threshold, the place where two entirely different orders of being met and briefly touched. This cosmological image of the moon as threshold has an interesting relationship to the mythological image of Selene as a goddess who descended from the sky to visit a sleeping mortal on a mountain. The goddess crossing from the eternal order of her celestial path down into the particular world of a cave on a specific granite hillside was, in mythological terms, enacting something that the philosophical tradition would later describe in structural and geometric terms, the movement between the superlunary and the sublunary, the crossing of the boundary that Aristotle would draw at the moon's orbit. The myth was not a less accurate version of the philosophy. It was a different kind of language, reaching toward the same persistent observation about the moon, that it was not quite like anything else in the sky, that it moved between two orders of experience, that it crossed a line everything else respected. Hipparchus, at his instruments in Nicaea, or at the observatory he may have maintained on Rhodes, was engaged in an act of attention that had been going on since long before he was born. The Babylonian eclipse records he consulted to extend his observational baseline represented centuries of the same attention being paid by different people in different generations to the same body crossing the same sky. His calculation of the synodic month was the result not of a single night's observation, but of the accumulated work of many careful watchers laid end to end across a very long span of time. The moon's month came out, in his calculation, to 29 days, 12 hours, 44 minutes, and a small number of seconds that modern instruments refine only marginally. He arrived at that number by looking, and by reading the records of everyone who had looked before him, and by bringing the two ends of a long corridor of careful watching close enough together that the pattern in the middle became visible. There is a specific kind of patience in astronomical work of this kind. It is not the patience of waiting for something to happen. The moon does not make anyone wait for long. It changes its phase every night, and in a month the full cycle has completed and a new one has begun. The patience required is the patience of watching the same thing many times, carefully, and noting the small variations, the occasional anomalies, the places where the cycle does not behave as simply as a first approximation suggested. The lunar motion is not perfectly uniform. The moon speeds up and slows down in its orbit in ways that a simple circular model cannot fully account for. Hipparchus noticed this, noted the inequality, and developed the first observational evidence for what would later be called the lunar anomaly, the departure of the moon's actual position from where a simple average of its motion would place it. The discrepancy was small enough to require careful watching to detect, and significant enough to matter for the prediction of eclipses. He saw it because he was paying attention with the kind of sustained, repeated, unhurried attention that the sky rewards. Meton's 19-year cycle, similarly, was not visible in a single month of watching. To know that 235 lunar months align with 19 solar years, one needs either to have watched for 19 years or to have access to records that span that range. Meton had some combination of earlier Greek observation and his own work, and possibly access to records from further east. The number he arrived at, the 19-year cycle, 235 months, was precise enough to be genuinely useful, close enough to the truth that the festivals it was designed to synchronize actually stayed synchronized for decades before the small residual error needed correction. He gave the calendar makers a tool that worked. The moon, unknowing and indifferent to any of this, continued its 19-year patterns as it had been doing for the entirety of the time that anyone had been watching it from below. Anaxagoras would die in exile. The charges of impiety that the Athenians brought against him for his claims about the sun and moon eventually made his position in the city untenable, and he spent the end of his life in Lampsacus on the Hellespont, where he died around 428 BCE. The tradition holds that the citizens of Lampsacus held him in high regard, and that his tomb there was maintained with respect for many years after his death. The moon that he had called a stone was above Lampsacus the night he died, as it had been above Athens on the night he first said it aloud. The silver light that his contemporaries still understood as Selene's illumination reached down across the Greek world without distinguishing between cities, without adjusting its quality for the beliefs of the people below. It fell on the altars where offerings were set out at the new moon. It fell on the vase painters in their workshops and on the mathematicians at their instruments. It fell equally and with complete indifference on everything that was trying to understand it. The moon's mountains rise to several kilometers above the lunar surface in some ranges. The largest impact basins, filled with the ancient basalt of the Morea, stretch for hundreds of kilometers. The crater Tycho, in the southern highlands, sends rays of lighter ejecta across the surface in patterns still visible from Earth, with good naked-eye observation on a clear night. Plutarch's dialogue speaker, looking at the lunar disk and describing it as a terrain of elevations and depressions, was not wrong about the principle. He was working without an instrument powerful enough to resolve individual features, but the reasoning was sound, and the conclusion that the dark areas were lowlands, the brighter areas higher ground, was correct in its essential structure. When Galileo looked through his telescope in 1609, he saw the mountains individually, saw the shadows they cast on the flat plains below them, and confirmed the structural claim that had been waiting in Plutarch's dialogue for 15 centuries. The mountains were there all along. The shadows had been falling all along. They were falling on the night Plutarch looked up from Charonea and began to write the dialogue. They are falling tonight. Whatever the sky is above, wherever a person finds themselves lying in the dark, the moon is somewhere in it, or was recently in it, or will be in it again in a matter of hours. Its phase tonight is a specific phase, a particular slice of the cycle that Medon counted, that Hipparchus measured, that the Greek lunisolar calendar built its months around. If it is full, the Maria are visible from below as the dark, smooth patches they have been for billions of years, the same patches Plutarch's speaker described as the shadows of valleys.